My name is Paul Wolliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is the installation instruction video for my extended runtime fuel kit for generators manufactured by the Zonson Group using the 80cc Ratto engine and an offset or side mount fuel cap. As you may or may not know, the Zonson Group is a manufacturing company that private labels generators for several other brands, whether it's Wen or PowerSmart or Champion or whoever. The Zonson Group will manufacture them and put them in whatever color cabinet the retailer would like to see it in. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be shooting it on a Wen 2500. However, this video will apply to several other generators. Everything you need, with the exception of the fuel tank itself, comes in the kit. The most important item will be the flash drive with a copy of this video. So you'll plug this video in and get started. Real quickly, I wanted to cover, if you are watching this video on YouTube and you want more information on it, if you look in the description section below, you'll see a link to my website. Go to my website, and on the page for this particular product, you'll have plenty of information in text, as well as a demo video, an installation instruction video. I have an FAQ page. If you still don't see the information you're looking for, contact me through my website. Please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor comments on the YouTube videos. I simply don't have the time. But at any rate, let's go ahead and get started with the install. Okay, the first step to installing it is going to be to pull the cabinet apart. This side of the cabinet is held on with 4 small bolts with 8mm heads. The bolts are captive bolts. By that I mean that they stay in the cover itself, even though the bolt has unscrewed from the rest of the cabinet. I suspect they did this to keep you from losing the bolts. See what I mean? The bolts do not fall all the way out onto the ground. This side of the cabinet is held on the same way. Again, 4 bolts with 8mm heads. This side has the recoil start rope, so what we'll do is pull the recoil start rope out a little bit and then let the cover hang off the side of the workbench. Next, the rear needs to be removed. The rear housing is held on by 6 bolts. This particular generator was dropped, so the housing itself is cracked up here. So this bolt has nothing to go into, so we're going to remove these 5 bolts. On your generator, you should have a 6th bolt up in this corner. Hopefully your generator does not get damaged in shipping. If so, that's something you'll want to take up with whoever sold you the generator before installing my kit. and the kit lifts, or the cover lifts out. And here are the screws. These screws in the back cover are not captive screws like in the side cover. Okay, the next step is to pull the 6 bolts out of the front cover on the cabinet. And these bolts are identical to the bolts in the back cover. And there will be 6 of these. And you'll just lift this cover out enough to make some clearance. Let me set these bolts off to the side. These bolts are identical to the ones that were pulled out of the back cover. And all we need to do is just get this cover clear. Now what we're going to do is remove the orange cabinet from this side. So you'll take the fuel cap off. And then there's a lock ring that holds the fuel tank into the cover. Then there are 3 bolts along the bottom. They also have an 8mm head. Now the 3 bolts that were on the bottom here are not the same as the others. They're a much bigger bolt, they just have the same size head. So you'll set these bolts off to the side. Okay, the next step to removing the cabinet will be to remove the 3 bolts that go in to this side on the handle. And they also have an 8mm head on them. And these bolts are the same as were in the front and rear cover. You'll set them off the side. Okay, with both sides of the housing screws removed, you should be able to lift this side cover off. It does not need to come all the way out of the way, so we can just fold it off and let it hang by the wiring harness. This is going to give us access to the valve cover. And now we'll go ahead and pull the valve cover off. Okay, in order to remove the valve cover, first thing we're going to do is remove the breather hose. The breather hose is just this short piece of hose. Go ahead and set it off to the side for now. The valve cover itself is removed by taking out the 4 bolts with the 10mm heads. and the valve cover lifts right off. Now what we're going to do is take the valve cover over to the workbench so we can disable the PCV valve that's in it. Okay, in order to disable the PCV valve, we're going to remove the breather plate. The breather plate is removed by removing these 3 Phillips head screws that hold it into the valve cover. And then pop out the breather plate. Okay, the PCV valve itself is this thin wafer right here that I'm pushing up on with the pencil. So you'll push the thin wafer open with either a pencil, a pen, a small screwdriver, whatever. And then what we're going to do is zip tie the reed valve to the reed stop with one of the zip ties included in the kit. Then cut the tail off the zip tie. So if you look at it now, you'll see that the reed valve is held open. You can see through the hole, and you can see my finger moving behind it. And all I've done is just take a zip tie and zip tie the reed valve open against the reed stop. So now we're ready to go ahead and put the breather plate back into the valve cover. And that is done with the same Phillips head screws that we just removed. We will be installing a new PCV valve external to the engine. We're just disabling the one that's internal. And incidentally, I'd like to point out just for the moment that that is a PCV valve. I actually had somebody contact me saying, no, it's PVC. No, PVC is polyvinyl chloride, which is what plumbing pipes are made out of. This is PCV, as in positive crankcase ventilation. I constantly have people calling me up trying to correct me with misinformation. Please don't be that guy. It is a PCV, as in positive crankcase ventilation valve. Now, when you removed the valve cover from the engine, if your valve cover gasket is in perfect shape, which this one was, then you can reuse the original gasket. If not, the kit will come with a Yamaha valve cover gasket. The reason being is I can get replacement parts from Yamaha, and yes, this is a copy of the Yamaha engine. So the kit will include a Yamaha valve cover gasket just in case you need it. So now we're going to go ahead and put the valve cover back on the engine. As you'll notice, The original factory valve cover gasket is in perfect condition. So now we can simply reinstall the valve cover using the original bolts that we removed to take it off. I'm going to just put each bolt in loose, and then I'll go back and snug the bolts down. Okay, now we'll go ahead and assemble the main fuel hose. Okay, included in the kit, item 1 is a fuel pump. This is the fuel output port. This is the fuel input port, and this is the pulse line. There are caps on the fuel input port and fuel output port. Do not forget to remove those, otherwise you'll get no fuel flow. Included in the kit is a section of 1/4-inch rubber hose. First step is to cut a 3 3/4 inch section of the 1/4-inch rubber hose. We're going to put that on the output from the fuel pump. Here's a cap with just a little bit of oil, which makes it a lot easier to put these hoses on. So we put the 3 3/4 inch hose on the output port. Then we'll take our bag of small parts. Among the items in the small parts are hose clamps. There are 2 different sizes of hose clamps. There's the large one, and that goes on the 1/4-inch hoses. Then the small ones, and that goes on the 3/16 hoses. This is a 1/4-inch hose, so it'll get one of the large hose clamps right here. To set these hose clamps, you simply squeeze them down. If they get twisted, you can squeeze them side to side. If you need to remove a hose clamp, grab one end and just rock it sideways like that, and it undoes itself. So the hose clamps are fairly convenient. There are going to be places on this kit that you will not use a hose clamp, but rather that you're going to be using a zip tie, because the clearance is so tight inside that little generator that there's not enough room for the hose clamp. The zip ties work just as well, but they're not reusable. Once you set a zip tie in place, the only way to get it off is to cut it off. So that's why I prefer to use the hose clamps wherever they'll fit. You have enough hose clamps to use them in every location if you're persistent enough to get them in there. Otherwise, you're going to discover it's a whole lot easier to put the zip ties in certain locations. Because of the close quarters inside this generator, this is the only hose that we're going to put onto the fuel pump for right now. Now we're going to go ahead and assemble the main fuel line. And that'll be the fuel coming into the pump. This is the one that comes out of the pump and goes to the carburetor. So the first thing we're going to do is cut a 13-inch section of our 1/4-inch fuel hose. And then in the bag of small parts is a 1/4-inch fuel tee. We'll get just a little bit of oil on the 1/4-inch fuel tee. And we'll put it into our 13-inch hose just like that. The next thing we'll do is cut a 3 3/8 section of the 1/4-inch hose. And it goes on to the fuel tee like this. Then we're going to cut a 2 1/8 section of the 1/4-inch hose. And that's going to go on to this port of the fuel tee. Then included in the kit is a 1/4-inch to 3/16 reducer. And we will touch on this in just a minute. This goes into the 1/4-inch, 2 1/8 piece of hose that we just installed on the fuel tee. Then included in the kit is a piece of 3/16 hose, and it's about 8 inches long. We're going to put that on to the other end of the reducer, the 3/16 inch end. So now you've got a piece shaped just like this. The next step is going to be to take the fuel filter that is included in the kit, and that'll go on to this hose that you had earlier cut to 3 3/8 inch. Notice that there are arrows on the fuel filter, and those point in the direction of fuel flow. And since it's going to flow from the remote tank into this hose, which then goes to the fuel pump, and this hose comes from the stock tank to tee it all in. Then take the remaining piece of hose, put a little bit more oil on it, on the fuel filter, and slide the remaining piece of hose onto the fuel filter like this. This hose you will be trimming to the exact length later on once you get it all inside. Okay, now that we've got our main fuel line assembled, it's time to start putting the hose clamps on. The kit comes with 2 different sizes of hose clamps. You've got the large hose clamp for the 1/4-inch hose, the small hose clamps for the 3/16 hoses. So, in order to make your life easier, put the hose clamps on exactly the way I'm showing you. This is the fuel tee, and this is the 13-inch section of hose that goes to the pump. And we're going to put this hose clamp with the clasp portion facing away from the 3rd leg of the fuel tee. Then on the top of that fuel tee, we're going to put another hose clamp, and again the clasping portion is going to point away from the 3rd leg, or the 3rd barb. Then on the 3rd barb, the clasp portion is going to point straight up. Like this. Then on the 1/4 inch to 3/16 reducer, we'll put the 1/4 inch hose clamp on this side, and the clasping portion points toward this 13-inch section of hose. Then the 3/16 clamp will go on the 3/16 hose, pointing straight up. Then the fuel filter, both of the clamps are going to face the same way that the first 2 clamps on the fuel tee did. This kit will have enough hose clamps to clamp every position with a hose clamp. However, some of the positions are so tight that I use a zip tie. The difference between the zip tie and the hose clamp is, simply put, the hose clamp is reusable. If you put it on and you don't like it, you grab it with a pair of pliers and twist sideways and it releases. The zip tie, once you put it on, the only way to get it off is to cut it. However, there are certain locations where it's just so tight to get one of these white plastic hose clamps in is almost impossible. So there are certain locations where I put a zip tie on it. However, if you are tenacious enough, there are enough hose clamps that you can put a hose clamp in every position if you desire. And now we'll go ahead and remove the stock hose that goes from the fuel selector valve on the front of the generator to the carburetor so that we can install our main fuel line. Okay, this hose right back here is the hose that runs from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. This hose is held on with Corbin clamps, and to undo a Corbin clamp, you squeeze the tabs and just wiggle the clamp back. Once I get this off, I'll show you in close-up detail so you can get a better view of how a Corbin clamp works. Before you wiggle this hose completely off, make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the closed position, otherwise it'll drip gasoline. But then you go ahead and slide the hose the rest of the way off. On the carburetor there's another Corbin clamp, and it works the same way that the one on the fuel selector valve did. Okay, on a Corbin clamp you'll have 2 tabs that you squeeze together. If you look at it from the end, when you squeeze them together, the part that goes around the hose is big. When you release them, the part that goes around the hose gets smaller. See if I can get a better angle on that without dropping this. There, they're squeezed together. The hose portion is large. When you release the 2 tabs, the part that goes around the hose gets smaller. And that's how a Corbin clamp works. Now, if you noticed earlier, I had an adapter to go from 3/16 to 1/4 inch hose. That's because if you look at this end of the hose, it's 3/16 inch. If you look at this end of the hose, it's 1/4 inch. It's a formed hose. I've also had people call me up or email me telling me that in my kit I put a 1/4 inch where one end of this hose used to be and a 3/16 where the other end of the hose used to be. Again, don't be that guy. As you can clearly see, this hose is 3/16 at one end, 1/4 at the other, and I simply use an adapter to go from 3/16 to 1/4 because I'm not a large enough company to have custom-made formed hoses. Okay, so now it's time to install our main fuel line. If you look in here, you can see the stock fuel hose that runs from the tank to the fuel selector valve. There's a slight area above it, so you can slide one hose between this fuel hose and the tank. So what we're going to do is the 13-inch section of hose that goes from the fuel tee to the fuel pump is going to go above the stock fuel hose. This fuel hose that has the 1/4 inch section and then is reduced to 3/16 is going to go below it. So we're going to go ahead and push these through so you can see here is the stock hose, here is the 13-inch section of hose, and here is the hose that starts as 1/4 and then gets reduced to 3/16. And we're just going to slide this into place, and then we'll go around to the other side of the generator. Okay, now you can see our hoses. Here's the 3/16 hose, and here is the 13-inch hose that connects to the fuel pump. Okay, so now we're back over to the opposite side of the generator where the carburetor is. And you can see our fuel hoses coming through. This is the 13-inch hose that we slid above the stock hose that went from the fuel tank to the fuel selector valve. This is the 3/16 hose that we have run from the other side. Okay, so now we're on the carburetor side of the generator. This is the 3/16 hose that is slid into the 3/16 reducer coming off the fuel tee. This is the 13-inch section of hose that we had on the bottom leg of the fuel tee. So what we're going to do is put a little bit of light oil on this barb of the fuel pump and slide this hose onto it. Then we're going to put a little bit of light oil on this hose and slide it onto the fuel input line of the carburetor. So this hose is now onto the input line of the carburetor, and now we're going to put a little bit of oil on this hose and slide it onto the carburetor inlet. Okay? Okay, now that we've got this hose hooked from the output port of the fuel pump to the carburetor, I'm going to put a zip tie on the end that goes to the carburetor inlet port. And that's because it is such a tight fit that I really don't want to fight with putting one of the hose clamps on there. If you wish to fight and put a hose clamp on there, there are enough hose clamps. So I'm going to put the zip tie on out here, then slide it up into place before I pull it tight. And you want to make every effort to get it in the exact right position before you pull it tight, because it cannot be undone. You'd have to cut the zip tie and then start over again with another zip tie. And now I'll reach in there and cut the tail off of this zip tie. So now that we have those hoses in place, it's time to put the cabinet back together so that we can adjust the length of this particular 3/16 hose to the exact length that'll be the best fit for this generator. This hose is a little bit longer than it needs to be, but we're going to trim it to fit once we get it all together. Now you'll notice that there's a tab right here in the fuel tank that sticks into a slot right here in the back of the housing, and another tab on the fuel tank that slides into another slot on this part of the fuel housing, and this would be on the recoil side of the generator. So we will slide our fuel tank into those two slots next. Okay, so now that we've got these two slots on this housing, have had the tabs from the fuel tank slid into those slots, we're going to take this side housing, we're going to lift it up into place, and we're going to feed the fuel inlet into the hole at the top of this side of the cabinet housing. And then we'll slide the cabinet housing together. And just check with your fingers to make sure that that fuel tank has stayed in its guides. If you'll notice, the rubber grommet that goes around the fuel inlet is slid out of place, which means we get to do this over again. So you'll want to make sure that this ring is in place on this hole in the cabinet. Slide that over the fuel inlet, and then slide the two halves of the cabinet together and make sure that the fuel tank did not slide out of the two notches on the back side of the generator. Now there are tabs running along the top that have to be slid in together before you put the screws in. When you look at it, at the top, your cabinet should be nicely fitted together. And right in here, if you stick your fingers in there, you can feel that this tab of the fuel tank is slid into a slot in the cabinet here, and there's a tab on the fuel tank here that is slid into a slot on the cabinet here. Our O-ring around our fuel neck is correctly in place. So now, before anything goes crazy, we're going to go ahead and put the 3 screws into the opposite side of the cabinet. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put the 3 bolts that we originally took out in these positions here. Now you'll notice that there are 3 bolts on this side of the cabinet which we never took out in the first place, so we don't have to put those back in. However, on the other side of the cabinet there are 3 bolts at the bottom. Here are the 3 bolts that we took out of here, here, and here. So we're going to go ahead and lift the cabinet up into place and put those 3 bolts in now. Okay, here are the 3 bolts that we took out of here, here, and here. So now we're going to go ahead and put these bolts back into the cabinet. And we're just going to put them in loose until we get all 3 started, and then we'll go back and snug them down. Okay, now we want to make sure that the wires from the carbon monoxide leak detector did not get pinched into this portion of the cabinet when we put this back into place. At this time, we'll double check the O-ring that goes around the fill neck, and we'll go ahead and put the lock ring that locks the fuel tank into this side of the cabinet. This side of the cabinet, the fuel tank is held on by the lock ring around the fuel neck, and on the other side, it's held into place in the cabinet by those 2 pins that slide into those 2 slots in the cabinet. Okay, so now the fuel neck is secured. We can slide the front housing into place. Okay, we're going to go ahead and slide the front housing up into place. There are several tabs in it, 2 at the top that slide into these 2 notches. And then we'll put the top 2 bolts in first. Okay. And then we'll just slowly work our way down. Put the center 2 bolts in. And then the bottom 2 bolts. And then we'll go back and snug them all down. I'm going to come back over this side just to make sure the keys are snug before I do the front cabinet. Okay. Then we'll put our fuel cap on. Okay, so now we come back around to our fuel pump. This is the 3/16 hose that went on to the adapter that went to a 1/4 inch hose. And this, we're going to trim it to the appropriate length and slide it onto the back of the fuel selector valve. So it's going to turn and go right on the back of the fuel selector valve. But as you can see, it's going to have to be shortened just a little bit. Here's the hose, and here's the barb on the back of the fuel selector valve. So we're going to take the fuel pump. We're going to make sure that it has plenty of room sitting in here, because that's going to determine the length and the routing of this 13-inch hose. Okay, now that we've got the cabinet secured, this is the fuel T. We've taken and run the fuel filter hose behind this bracket on the cabinet. And it'll lay right here, and ultimately it'll run above the ignition coil right here and follow the main high tension plug wire right through this groove, and it'll come out the other side. Okay, so now we're going to take this hose, we're going to route it right next to the high tension lead from the ignition coil. We're going to go just to the left and route it right out the other side. So now you can see, here's the fuel T. Here's the fuel hose. It runs behind this spar. The hose runs over the ignition coil and then out the other side of the housing. So now, with this in place, we can go around to the other side and see exactly how much we need to trim off that 3/16 hose to hook it up to the back of the fuel selector valve. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and trim our 3/16 hose. Let me mark it with my thumb. Just to give you an idea, okay, I wound up trimming it to where this 3/16 hose was exactly 6.5 inches long, where it went from the reducer for 1/4 inch to 3/16 and where it plugs onto the back of the fuel selector valve. So I trimmed mine exactly 6.5 inches long, if that gives you a guideline. Okay, so I trimmed my 3/16 hose to exactly 6.5 inches long. I'm going to go ahead and put some oil on the hose, a little bit of oil on the fuel selector valve, and then take a pair of pliers and slide that hose onto the hose barb on the fuel selector valve. And there it goes. That's the hose barb, or the hose slid on the back of the fuel selector valve. And now I'm going to put one of the 3/16 hose clamps in that location. Okay, as you can see now, there's one of the small 3/16 hose clamps. So now we want to make sure that the input hose and the output hose for the fuel pump are not kinked and not run near anything that has to move. Okay, it's nice and clear. Now, this is a short elbow fitting into the intake manifold that used to go to the stock breather hose. We're going to go ahead and pull that out, and it looks like this. So we pulled that out of the intake manifold. Then included in the kit is a fully assembled PCV valve. You'll notice that I have zip ties at all the joints on this because there are so many connections and it is such a tight fit. This hose here is going to go to the valve cover where the stock breather hose came off. I'm going to put a zip tie in this location also because it's so difficult to get at it where it's behind that spar. This location where it goes on to the fuel pump, I'm going to use a hose clamp. I'm just putting a little bit of oil onto the hose, and then I'm going to slide it onto the original fitting on the valve cover where the factory breather hose went to. Then this spigot for the PCV valve is going to slide into the intake manifold exactly where that 90-degree fitting came out. And then this hose from our PCV valve is going to go to the pulse line on the fuel pump. We're going to put just a little bit of oil on that and slide that together. And there you have it. So if you look at this hose up here goes to the breather line with a breather port on the valve cover. Comes down here, goes through the new PCV valve and into the intake boot. This line, which has the 90-degree fitting, I'll pull it down so you can see it better, has the 90-degree fitting here at the top, comes down and goes into the pulse port on the fuel pump, which is where I'm going to put one of the white hose clamps, because that's actually a place that's easy enough to get at. Okay, then I'm going to put another white hose clamp on the fuel inlet port of the fuel pump. And now we're just going to tuck the fuel pump right in here, so when we snap this cover on, everything will fit nicely. I'm going to go ahead and run the choke through the full range of motion, just to make sure that the choke is not being interfered with in any way. Okay, so the choke is nice and clear. If the end of your choke wire is super long and hits the new breather line, it has to be either trimmed or bent out of the way, because if you poke a hole in the breather line, you lose your pressure and vacuum wave, which drives the fuel pump. So make sure that that choke wire doesn't poke a hole in this. On mine, it's bent straight down. Okay, this is the last section of hose, and this is the one that I said you'll have to trim to length once you get it in place on the generator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the fuel inlet port right here behind the spark plug access. There is an emissions sticker, and unfortunately we're going to drill a hole right through that emissions sticker. If you see, there's a slot for a tab from the outer cover. So directly above that slot for the outer cover, and then center it right through the center of that emissions sticker is where we're going to drill our hole for the fuel inlet port. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make sure, push our hand back here to make sure that the fuel tank hasn't slid out of place. It's still locked into the two tabs. And as far as front to back, it's going to be centered right in the center of this little notch on the housing. And side to side, it's going to go right through the center of this emission sticker. And once I get it drilled, I'll pull the camera and show you a good look at it. Okay, you can see as far as left to right, lined directly up with the center of this, and then side to side, this way to this way, just about center of that emission sticker. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to face the fuel port with the pins facing forward, because we don't want to snap our fuel hose on and have our fuel hose hanging back across the hot exhaust, which faces the rear of the generator. My ideal way to do it is run the fuel hose under the handle from the opposite side and then snap it on. That way you know that the fuel hose is routed in such a way that it's not going to get onto anything. The bottom half of the fuel hose will screw on to the hose barb, and you'll cinch it down. If you wanted to provide somewhat of a strain relief, the kit will also have a 1/2-inch washer. You can pass the fuel fitting through the 1/2-inch washer, and it will spread the load over a larger section of this plastic housing, so it'll be just a little bit more robust. But when you run it under the handle, run the fuel line under the handle like that, that'll help you out quite a bit. So the first step is going to be to take some of the Teflon tape included in the kit and wrap it around the threads of the fuel fitting, being very careful not to overlap the end of the threads. As in, don't do like this, because if you do, that'll get sheared off when you thread the hose barb onto the end of it. So we're going to layer or wrap a few layers of Teflon tape around this. I'm going to go ahead and put the 1/2-inch washer on top so it provides a bit of a strain relief, and then start the threads on my hose barb. Okay, when you go to screw this down tight, you notice we haven't put the back cover on yet, and that'll give us a little bit more room to get at it if you wanted to go through the back. I'm going to do it right through the side here because I think it'll give me enough room. But what we're going to do is just go ahead and cinch this fuel inlet fitting. And you want it to where when it tightens down, it's facing pretty much straight forward. And then we'll take and tear off our piece of Teflon tape. Now, take your leftover piece of fuel line, and what I'm going to do is cut it just a little bit longer than I think it's going to need to be, because I can always cut it shorter. Okay, so I'm going to need to take another 1/2 inch off of it. Test it again. Okay, I like that. Now what I'm going to do is put a little bit more oil on the hose barb and a little bit of oil on the hose and slide the hose up onto that hose barb. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and get another hose clamp. Okay, here's what I meant about the routing. I would take your fuel line that's included in the kit, run the fuel line under the handle, and then snap it to the fuel port on the generator, and that way it's nice and protected, and it'll run off to that side of the generator, and it'll keep it from getting anywhere near the hot exhaust, because obviously you don't want to run a fuel line in front of an exhaust on the back of the generator. Okay, now what we need to do is look at all the hoses and everything we've done, make sure that there's no hoses pinched, no wires pinched, nothing like that, and then we're going to go ahead and put the cabinet back together. Okay, as you may or may not remember from earlier in this video, this particular cabinet had some damage. You'll see that the place where the upper left-hand screw goes, there's nothing there. The other 5 screws are still there. There are 2 tabs on the top of this rear cover that slide up right here and here. Normally there's another tab on the orange section. That's broken on this particular generator as well. Like I say, a little bit of shipping damage, and I'll deal with the shipper on that later. But what we're going to do is go ahead and slide the top into place. What I would do is put the top 2 screws in. However, on this generator I won't be able to, because there's no place to put the other top screw. So I'm just going to put one top screw in place and then start working my way down. Do the 2 center screws. Okay, I've got these snugged, and typically Wen has a very good fit and finish, so it should fit nicely in there. If it doesn't, it means some tab is not in place correctly, or something is not right, because like I say, the Wen has a very good fit and finish on their generators. I'm just going to tip it up to look at the bottom. Make sure that those tabs are in place, and they are. Okay, now we're going to put the recoil side housing on. And when we set it in place, we want to take a good look and make sure that the recoil start rope, which is down here, is nowhere near our fuel line, which it's not, so that's good. We're going to go ahead and snap the snap locks in, and then we'll run the 4 screws into the housing. Incidentally, I like to put the rear housing on first because it is just a little bit trickier. Okay, this side housing will be the last part of the housing to go putting in place. Okay, the last step is the instruction sticker, and it tells you how to use the stock fuel tank and then how to use the remote fuel tank. Real quickly, the stock fuel tank is you don't make any special allowances whatsoever. You use it the same way as you did before I ever installed the kit on it. I'm going to install this sticker on this side of the generator because there's plenty of room to install it. And there you have it. Okay, so that completes the install. So now what we're going to do is go outside and test run it, make sure everything works correctly. Once again, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you have any more questions about this, please do not try to contact me through YouTube comment section. I don't monitor the comments. I simply don't have time to. If you want to get in touch with me, go to my website. There's a link in the description below. And you can go to the product page. There's a tremendous amount of text on it. There's an install video, a demo video, a fuel tank selection video, FAQ page. And if you still don't see what you want, either give me an email or a phone call. At any rate, I thank you so much for your time.